like amp. Enjoy that, and so I got a job at the vet clinic, and now I'm sitting here and I'm like, I don't want to do this for the next 30 years of my life.
That's a good thing that you got that job and found that out.
Yeah,
You know, especially before you racked up too much student debt. Pursuing that idea,
yeah, but now I don't have a clue what I want to do with it.
you've got time. You've got time. Try a little bit of everything, see what appeals to you. That's what's great about being young. Get out there and travel if you can. Travel's a good thing to do. Okay, we'll wait a minute or two and see if anybody else joins us. Let's see, I think everybody who's on screen has done their test. If that's wrong, correct me. But remember that the test is supposed to be completed by this time next week by the 1st. So be sure that you get that taken care of. Oh, not the 1st. I'm sorry, it would be the 7th. The 1st is tomorrow. Duh. This is why I don't teach math. And we are planning to do the instrument test next week. So if you're still trying to get your vocab test done, let's get that taken care of so you don't have 2 tests right on top of each other. That would not be okay. So last week we did voice parts and choir. We did keyboard instruments like piano and harpsichord and organ, and we did strings. So today we're going to continue with woodwinds, brass, and percussion. That doesn't sound like a lot, but the percussion category is huge, enormous, and I didn't put them all in there. I put in the big ones and picked a couple of fun ones and left the rest alone because we could be here for a week talking about percussion instruments, and as long as you understand the basics, you'll be okay there. So let's go ahead and get rolling because we do have a lot to get through tonight. Folks on Zoom, can you see my screen that says woodwinds?
Yeah, I can.
Excellent. So take a look, please, at this picture because this is an important thing. This is a picture of a couple, 2 clarinets that are in pieces. These keys, this system of keys, some holes are open, some are closed. There are little keys, big keys, all kinds of keys. This key system is called the Boehm key system, B-O-E-H-M. And this is the unifying family characteristic for the woodwind family. All woodwinds have some version of this Boehm key system. Once upon a time, back in the olden days, woodwinds did not have these keys. It was just open hole stops, like when you played recorder in 3rd grade and you learned to play hot cross buns. And then eventually somebody, I guess Mr. Boehm, figured out that if you had something like these hole covers, it actually was like giving you more fingers and you could cover more holes at the same time by just pushing down one key. More than one thing would move. Like if I put my finger here on this key and I push down on this open hole, this also closes. So it's like closing 2 holes with only one finger. And that expanded the range of the instruments and made you able to play much higher and much lower than you could play on your recorder that you had in 3rd grade. So the first 2 members of our woodwind family are the flute and the piccolo. Notice that they also have a version of this Boehm key system. Some flutes are open hole flutes. This one appears to be an open hole flute. And some are closed. Usually beginner flutes, when you first start playing flute, are all closed keys. And then later on, you step up to a more advanced instrument and then the holes are open. Piccolo is like a flute that's gone through the dryer and it has shrunken. Piccolos are often made of wood, where our modern flutes are made of metal. They don't have a visible reed. All the other woodwind instruments we're going to talk about have some version of a visible reed, but flutes do not. In order to create the sound, you blow air across this tone hole, and that's what creates the vibration, which then in turn becomes the sound of the flute or the piccolo. Piccolo is not a beginner instrument. I know it looks much smaller than the flute, and that's because it is, but that means that everything here is compactified and it's much more difficult to control than this instrument, which is a little bit larger. You do not want to give a piccolo to a beginner. That would not be a happy time. These are the highest voices in the woodwind family, with piccolo being an octave above the flute because of its size. The smaller it is, the higher it plays. That is the rule in music. He's 9 years old. Beautiful tone. Okay, we'll stop right there. That gave you a pretty good representation of how high and how low the flute can play. It doesn't matter how great a flute player you are, you can't play as low as a tuba, you just can't because of the way the flute is designed. Now here's a piccolo, compare the sound. Like the little bird that sings with Mary Poppins. That's a very famous piccolo solo in Stars and Stripes Forever. A good representation of how high the piccolo can play. That's why you don't want to give it to a beginner. It would not be okay. The oboe is next in score order. When you look at a musical score, it would be flutes and then oboes right below it. The oboe, look at all these keys. Holy mackerel. There are keys everywhere on the oboe. And here is the important different characteristic that separates oboe from clarinet. Some people mix them up, but the oboe uses a double reed that functions as its mouthpiece. It does have the bone key system. When you play a double reed instrument, these actually go into your mouth and you blow through them. Kind of like blowing through a straw. If you collapse a straw, then you blow through it and kind of get that honky goose sound. That's sort of what happens here, except these reeds are made of very thin wood. Here is how you make oboe reeds. That's what they sound like.
Yeah, hello, I'm Kashin, I'm KG, and this is my factory. Yeah, I make reeds and oboes. And Jen is today visiting my factory, and Jen took some videos and pictures. I hope everybody likes it.
You notice that this is all being done by hand. If it's too thick, it won't vibrate properly. If it's too thin, it will break. A reed that is too dry won't vibrate properly. A reed that is too wet will stick together. Just gotta reverse. Notice she's wrapping everything by hand. If it's just a little bit too thick, they can scrape it. And this is why oboe and bassoon reeds are so expensive. Because the good ones are handmade. You can learn to make your own reeds. It's a time-consuming process. But if you're serious about playing oboe and bassoon, it's an important skill. Okay, we're gonna stop right there because he's gonna show you bassoon reeds, and that's kind of the same thing. So the oboe has a little bit of a nasal quality. It kind of sounds like that, and that comes from the double reed. When you hear the clarinet play later, you'll hear the difference. They look very similar. There are similarities in the sound, but the oboe has definitely a more nasal quality. Some people start right on oboe as beginners, but often we start them on clarinet or flute and then move kids that are interested and really willing to work hard to oboe, because it takes a lot to become a proficient oboe player. It's not an easy instrument to master. The English horn is also a double reed instrument. It's longer than the oboe in overall length, so it plays with a slightly lower sound. It also has the family characteristic, the bone key system. Notice that the double reed sits on this little curved mouthpiece. It's curved because of the length of the instrument. You're going to see that on the bassoon as well. If it wasn't curved, it would be so long that it would be hard to reach the lower keys. This bulb at the end of the English horn is a good way to distinguish it from the oboe. Because if you just look at them and they're not side by side, it can be hard to tell how much longer this one is. But the oboe doesn't have this bulb. It has more of a bell at the end. But for some reason, the English horn has a bulb. I don't know why. Oh, by the way, the English horn doesn't come from England. I don't know why they call it that. We've forgotten over time. It's very pretty tone. So you can kind of hear that nasal quality here too, but because the pitch is not quite as high, it's not as pronounced. The bassoon. Give you a picture of this young man and his fancy duds to give you an idea of how large the bassoon is. Because the bassoon is very large, it plays very low. This curvy thing is called a vocal, and it holds the double reed. If it was straight, you would have to stand up to play the bassoon, and you probably wouldn't be able to reach all of the holes and keys. Notice please that this one has fewer keys in the bone system than a lot of the other stuff we've seen. A lot of its holes are open. It is a double reed instrument and it plays very low. It uses the bone key system. And we talked about the vocal. So here's a very famous bassoon soli section that if you've ever seen Disney's Fantasia, you've probably heard before. That's Mickey and the Brooms, right? Bassoons are delicate instruments, and again, it's one that we don't usually start beginners on, mainly because if you start as a young beginner, the bassoon is taller than you. You can't play it until you get a little bit bigger and you can handle it. Bassoons are the lowest woodwind voice in most orchestras. Now, that's not true if you have, a contrabassoon around. These are kind of rare. It's also a double reed. It also uses the bone key system, but because it is enormous, so enormous that it has to wrap around itself. And you have to have this peg on the floor to help you hold it. It plays really, really low.
This is a French contrabassoon made by Buffet Crampon from Paris. And it is slightly different to the contrabassoon you would normally see, which would be a German system. The wood is different. It's made from Bubinga wood as opposed to maple for the German contra. And the reason they use that is because it's a bit tougher, a bit more dense, so they can bore it a bit so the walls are thinner, which gives a bit of a brighter sound. The metal on it is red brass, and it has the sort of authentic French sound.
It's a good shot of the double reed there. See how it's in sound. I can honestly say I don't think I've ever seen a contrabassoon in the flesh. If I have seen it, I don't remember it, and I think I would remember that. So that brings us to the single reeds now, the clarinet, which is a very familiar instrument, which also uses the bone key system. Now, up here at the top, this is called the mouthpiece because it goes in your mouth. And this gadget holds the reed onto the mouthpiece. It's called a ligature. And sometimes these are made of metal. They make them out of leather now. They make them out of plastic. There are lots of different kinds of ligatures. When I was a beginning clarinet player a very long time ago, metal was your only choice. And then it has some screws here that help you to hold the reed onto the mouthpiece. Then you have a barrel joint. And then there are two parts of the body. This is a kind of a drawing, so it's not completely accurate. The body comes apart here, and then the bell attaches down here. So remember we talked about the English horning hat and a bulb. This has a bell, and it's more flared than the bell that was on the oboe. The most common clarinet is the B-flat clarinet. But there are several different sizes that are pitched in different keys. This is what single reeds look like, as opposed to the double reeds that we saw earlier. Most single reeds are manufactured, mass manufactured, as opposed to double reed, double reeds that are made by hand. So single reeds tend to be cheaper in price than double reeds, and the larger the instrument, the bigger your reed needs to be. So clarinet reeds are going to be smaller than saxophone reeds, and saxophone reeds are going to be smaller than baritone saxophone reeds. As you go up in size, your reed also has to go up in size. This is what vibrates to create the sound, the vibration that then becomes musical sound. So again, this can't be all chipped up and torn up, and it's got to be in good working condition. It can't be too wet, and it can't be too dry. Keeping your reeds in good working condition is a really important part of learning to play a reed instrument, and beginners go through a lot of reeds. It's just a rite of passage. It's just how it is, until they get a little bit better at putting the reed on the instrument, taking good care of it, remembering to take it off, because if you leave it on indefinitely, it will mold under there, and that is, let me tell you, disgusting. So you can see her ligature. Hers is the style that has the screws away from her chin. You look really carefully. Good job, Emma. Now, if you compare that sound to what we heard on the oboe and the English horn, you can hear a definite difference in sound quality because of the single reed as opposed to the double reed. The bass clarinet is the B-flat clarinet's larger brother. It's still a single reed instrument with a bone key system, but it's much bigger, so it plays lower. It has a curve and then the bell points up. Here's where it comes apart, and this is called a gooseneck. It's like a giant vocal, and the gooseneck fits in here, and then the mouthpiece would sit here. Most bass clarinets also have a floor peg that will attach right around here to help you hold the instrument when you're sitting. You waited all day for that solo. So you hear how much lower in pitch the bass clarinet is. He is sitting and you can't see his feet, but I'm willing to bet there's a peg attached down here that's helping him hold that, because he's not wearing a neck strap. Some bass clarinet players will wear a neck strap also. Some bands march bass clarinet. They have their bass clarinet players march to help fill out their bass line. And in that case, you would definitely want to have a neck strap, so to help you hold the instrument, because it would just be big and unwieldy to march around without something to help you hold that. Here's a good shot too of the size of that mouthpiece. If you compare it to what that young lady was using on her regular B-flat clarinet, this one is substantially bigger. The saxophone, I think I skipped the picture. Here's the whole saxophone family. This is an alto saxophone. These are tenor saxophones. And this is a baritone saxophone. Now, those words probably sound familiar to you because they're the same words we used when we were talking about choir last week. There is also a soprano saxophone, which is not in this picture, but we're going to see one and hear one here in just a few minutes. This one, of course, is going to play the lowest. These two would be the next lowest. This is the alto voice, and then the soprano voice would play highest. They are single reed instruments that use a bone key system. Now, you immediately notice that these instruments are made of metal and they're a different color. Some people think they're brass instruments because they are the same color as these trombones back here, which are brass instruments, but they are not. They use a reed, so they are woodwind instruments. Color doesn't count. Soprano, alto, tenor, and baritone sizes. And saxophones are not part of the symphony orchestra as a general rule because they're too new. Saxophones are only about 175 years old, which I know sounds like a really long time. But when you think that we have examples of flutes that go back 10,000 years and percussion that goes back even longer than that, 175 years is not anything. Mozart never saw a saxophone. They hadn't been invented yet, so he couldn't write parts for them. Beethoven never saw a saxophone. They hadn't been invented yet, so he couldn't write parts for them. Now, more 20th century composers like Gershwin, who we just heard, part of American in Paris, will occasionally put saxophone parts in with their symphonies and their scores and their ballets because they had access to saxophone and they knew what they were capable of doing. But if you're playing older stuff, you're not going to find saxophone as part of your orchestra. Often, saxophone players will double on clarinet. So again, going back to that young lady on the clarinet, I'm willing to bet that if we had continued to watch that jazz band play for a while, she would have set that clarinet down and she would have picked up a saxophone because it's pretty easy to go back and forth between the two because there are similarities in the fingerings and they are both single reed instruments. They're not completely the same, but they're pretty similar. So saxophone players often are also clarinet players. Now here's a soprano saxophone. Notice that it is straight where these others are curved. There is also a version of the soprano saxophone that's just smaller this and does have a curve. But this is the more commonly seen soprano saxophone. It kind of looks like a clarinet on steroids, but it's made out of metal. There's a bigger tone. Just have it on the screen now. Maybe that's a pretty good spot to stop right there. Okay. Are there any questions about the woodwind family before we move on to brass? Okay, hearing no objections, we'll move on to brass. This is the brass family. They are not, in fact, made of brass. Not anymore. A very long time ago, yes, they probably were. But now we use a combination of metals to make them stronger and capable of better tone quality. The common family characteristic of all brass instruments is the cup-shaped mouthpiece that they use. This is a close-up of a trumpet 7C mouthpiece, pretty common mouthpiece. You can see here the hole that connects to the tubing that would go into the instrument itself. You put your lips on, not over, this sits on your lips, and you buzz your lips, and that's what creates the vibration. Trumpet is probably the most widely recognized member of the brass family. Here's its cup-shaped mouthpiece. This will come out for cleaning and for storage, and it has 3 valves. Now, often beginners will say, oh, I want to play trumpet, it's really easy, you can only play 3 notes. Nope, sorry, that is incorrect. The function of these valves is to actually make the instrument longer. If you take this valve out, it has all these holes in it. And when you depress this valve, then all these tubes line up with those holes. Oh, whoops, sorry about that. And it essentially lets the air go through some of these tubes where when the valve is up, that access is blocked. So you can have just first valve, you can have just second valve, just third valve, you can play first and second, you can play first and third, you can play second and third, you can play all 3 at the same time, you can play none at all. And depending on what you do with the shape of your mouth, which is called the embouchure, you can also play higher and lower by tightening and loosening your buzz. Now notice her trumpet is silver. The cornet looks and sounds a lot like a trumpet and actually has the same tubing, but it's been curved up more. You see this big bump back here. So it's shorter in overall length when you hold them side by side, but the tubing itself is identical in length if you stretched everything out. Which you don't want to do, by the way. Once upon a time, the cornet was the most popular instrument in the United States. It has the same number of valves that work the same way as a trumpet. It has the same cup-shaped mouthpiece. This one's really pretty. It's got a lot of carving and engraving on the metal. Pretty cool. They sound like a trumpet, they play like a trumpet. They're just a little shorter in if you stood them side by side. The French horn. The French horn is not from France, just like the English horn is not from England. Why is it called the French horn? We don't remember. Instead of valves, the French horn has rotors. You can see them, they're kind of like long paddles here that attach to these round rotors. In the back of these rotors, attaching the paddle to the rotation mechanism is some string. And let me tell you, when that string pops or slips off, those are a pain in the tuchus to fix. Been there, done that. Look at all the tubing in this French horn. Holy cannoli. The physics of the instrument are such that you can play many, many notes with your rotor combinations just by adjusting your embouchure. So French horn is a tricky instrument. You have to have a good musical ear. To be a good French horn player, you need to be a good singer. And you need to be able to hear pitch well and know when you're right or you're wrong. Because you can push down this first rotor, but if you're not really listening to what you're doing, you can play way too high or way too low. Notice that his hand is in the bell. It helps you to hold the instrument, yes, but it also acts as a bit of a mute to mitigate the overall sound. A French horn without anything in the bell can be really blary and really, really loud. These are the descendant of hunting horns. Have you ever seen on maybe a movie, people go out fox hunting and they spot the fox and they take their horns and they blow this horn call, and you can hear it for miles across the territory, so everybody knows to come and chase the poor fox. Those didn't have rotors and paddles and all this stuff, but they were really loud and blary, so they could be heard for a long way. When we put these into the orchestra, we didn't want them to be that loud and blary, so we found ways to mitigate that sound. And one way we did it was by putting a hand in the bell. Here's a whole bunch of French horns. Good shot of the cup-shaped mouthpiece. Good shot of rotors. French horns are really cool because they can play up high like a trumpet, or they can play down low like a trombone because of the physics of the instrument. I love a French horn section. I just think they sound really cool. The trombone. The trombone has a cup-shaped mouthpiece, but it has no valves. Instead, it has this slide. And you slide it out to make the instrument longer and play lower. And you slide it in to make the instrument shorter and play higher. You can also make adjustments, of course, with your embouchure. But this is the most classic example of a trombone. This group is called the Maniacal Four. They play trombone, the four of them, they play trombone, and they cover popular songs, and they're a lot of fun to listen to. I encourage you to go onto YouTube and find their Carry On My Wayward Son, which is also a really great cover, but I thought we'd listen to something different tonight. Okay, take a look at this guy here. This up. Oh, I'm sorry. He's actually playing what's called bass. Right there, huge. Okay, we'll stop before tambourine guy kicks in. And the lowest voice in our brass family, the tuba. It's the bass voice of the brass family. It can have 3 or 4 valves. This looks like a 4-valve tuba. 1, 2, 3, 4. Its marching version is called the sousaphone, named for the man who invented it, John Philip Sousa, just like the saxophone is named for Adolphe Sax, who invented it. If you go out and invent your own instrument, you get to name it too. Here's a sousaphone. It wraps around your body, so it's easier to carry. This would be hard to carry and march. Now, people do. There is such a thing as a convertible tuba, and you put this on your shoulder and you march around the field. I would much rather carry this. Personally, I think it's a much better idea. rope, and like a rich cows.
I'm Camden, and I'm the principal tuba of the Minnesota Orchestra. I've been playing with the orchestra for 12 seasons now. And I've been playing the tuba since about the age of 9. I initially got interested because my dad is a tuba player and a band director. Okay, now the tuba, making a sound on the tuba starts with the mouthpiece. And a lot of people, you get the question of how do you make sound on a brass instrument? All brass instruments have a mouthpiece. How do you make sound on a brass instrument? A lot of people say, well, you just blow. If I do that, what happens? Nothing. And then someone say, well, we have to push the buttons or the valves. Those are called the valves. Okay, let's try that. And push the valves. There's something missing. So what we do is we buzz our lips like this. And then you buzz it into the mouthpiece. And then the tuba or any brass instrument works as an amplifier and it projects the sound. So
Playing tuba is like putting your face in a bowl and blowing. It's humongous. The mouthpiece is huge, huge. But it gives you, but he gave you a really good look at what the cup-shaped mouthpiece looks like. Remember, the bigger the instrument, the bigger the mouthpiece. So that one was really large because this is a big tuba. Okay, any questions about brass instruments before we go on to percussion? Okay, hearing no objections, we're gonna go right on to percussion. This is a huge category, and again, I did not put them all in there. I tried to pick the ones that we're gonna most commonly run into, and some kind of interesting and fun ones. There are two types of percussion instruments. There is pitched percussion, which is capable of playing individual notes, and you can play a melody on it. And non-pitched, which plays rhythm only. The characteristic that binds the percussion section together is that you play them all by hitting or striking them. Some are played by using your hands. Some are played by using sticks or mallets. And some you can do either, depending on what kind of effect you want to get and the music that you're playing. But what's important is that you hit or you strike the instrument to produce sound. The timpani are an example of a pitched percussion instrument. See these pedals? That doesn't make them go faster. This is how you can stretch the head or loosen the head of the timpani to tune it to different pitches. There are all these wires on the outside, you can kind of see them, and they are connected to the head. So if I step on the pedal and I stretch that head, the pitch is going to go up. If I release the pedal and the head loosens, the pitch is going to go down. If you were really, really fast or you had enough timpani, you could play Mary Had a Little Lamb by changing the pitch. You would have to be super fast, but you could do it. Timpani were used to be called kettle drums. You may have heard that before because they look like a big kettle you cook soup in. And once upon a time, that's exactly what they were. But over time, we've developed, much more sophisticated instruments. They are made of metal. And then these heads are either a fibrous skin, which is a synthetic skin, or a plastic that is pliable. So when you stretch it, it doesn't crack and break. And the winner is they changed the pitch on that. Now it sounds higher than it did before. He's gonna make another adjustment. So timpani players have to be able to tune these quickly and accurately. Because in the course of that one solo, he changed this drum twice and this drum twice. And he did it without, having to really take time. He had to do it fast. So being a timpani player, notice he's sitting. Most orchestral timpani players sit because you don't play all the time. And so you sit and you wait for your turn and you get your tuning ready and then you go. Often timpani, there'll be more. He's only using 2, but my high school has 4 or 5 now of different sizes. We also use them in the pit for marching season. So there are bigger and smaller timpani, and they all have that pedal system so you can change them. Keyboard percussion is a category, not really a name. They are all played with mallets. Different mallets will give you different sounds. And they're all laid out like a piano keyboard, which is why we call them keyboard percussion. Like this is a C, C sharp, D, D sharp, E, F, F sharp, G, G sharp, A sharp, also B flat, B, and then we come to another C. If you know how to play piano, it's very helpful in learning to play keyboard percussion because you already know where everything is. One type of keyboard percussion instrument is the xylophone. These keys are usually made of wood or a very high quality resin plastic. They have kind of a punchy sound. And if you use a harder mallet, you're going to get a punchier, more percussive sound. If you use a wrapped mallet or a softer rubber mallet, you're going to get a less percussive sound, a little bit softer, gentler sound. And again, it's laid out like the piano keyboard. Here is C, C sharp, D, D sharp, E, etc. Ta-da! The marimba is another member of the keyboard percussion group. The marimba has wooden bars and it has these resonators. Now notice as these bars get bigger, the resonators get longer. That helps project the sound. It usually has a more mellow tone overall. And you usually use wrapped mallets on marimba instead of those harder, more plasticky mallets or wood mallets that we just heard on the xylophone. So it's not going to be as punchy a sound. Notice he's giving 4 mallets. You can even use 6 or 8. It's a good stuff, good stuff. So you can really hear the difference between that and the xylophone sound, much more mellow, not as percussive, not as pointed, for lack of a better word. And then we have the vibraphone. The vibraphone actually has an electric motor that turns little discs inside the resonators to create a vibrato or a vibrating tone, which is why it's called the vibraphone. The vibraphone is often used in jazz music, marimbas too, but vibraphone more commonly used in jazz instruments or jazz tunes. Notice his mallets, wooden handles, wrapped heads. Inside that wrapped head is probably a plastic, and then it's wrapped in, this is like yarn, very thin yarn. And that's gonna protect the bars, which are metal on a vibraphone. And it's also going to help that sound not be so percussive and a little more mellow and pleasant. If you look, you see him stepping on a pedal down here, the piano pedal. That helps to control those resonators. It pulls a muting device away from the metal bars. So you get more vibration. It's fun, but I'm not finding, I don't think there is one till the end. So vibraphone, metal bars and an electric motor that makes the rotors turn. Glockenspiel, also called orchestra bells, are metal bars, a much smaller instrument, no resonators. And they have a much higher tone because, as you notice, these are pretty little. The smaller it is, the higher it plays. You can use metal, plastic mallets on these. The bane of my existence when I was a band director was when we had to use brass mallets on bells. I hate that. It's kind of like fingernails on chalkboard to me, just because it's so high pitched and punchy. And I'm not a fan. Orchestra bells are one of the instruments that beginning percussionists often have to learn to play before they move on to xylophone, marimba, or vibraphone. Again, it's laid out like a piano keyboard. Here's C, C sharp, D, D sharp, E, F, etc. And these are in a case, you can snap the cover back here, flip it, and lock it. Pick them up, walk away. You can't do that with as easily with the xylophone maroon, but we're a fire company. Now, thankfully, in this video, they're using a rubber mallet instead of brass mallet, so I'll be able to stay in the room. Notice the open space underneath the bars, that's what creates the resonating chamber. Pretty. I didn't see anything. Okay, so now we're moving on to non-pitched percussion. Instruments that can only play rhythm. You can't play Somewhere Over the Rainbow on the snare drum. It's not going to sound like Somewhere Over the Rainbow because it's not going to change pitch. You can't do it on a bass drum because it's not going to change pitch. The bass drum, as you would think, is the largest and provides the basic beat, usually. And the snare drum is its partner. We call these battery percussion instruments because you hit this head. And in the case of a snare drum, this lower head has these little metal gadgets called snares. And they vibrate to create that snare sound. Now there's a lever, it looks like on this snare drum, it's right about here, that you can pull, and it pulls those snares away. And then they won't vibrate. And then this turns into what we call a field drum or a tom. So putting the snares against the lower head so they vibrate makes it a snare. So here's a smaller bass drum and a snare drum. Kind of the beginning of a drum kit. He's going to use a kick pedal to play the bass drum. Hear that snare sound? That's called the drum roll. Good example of syncopation there. You're just gonna have to stop him because again, there is not a cadence. So snare, smaller, but it has that snare head on the bottom that makes that rattly sound. Cymbals. Cymbals can be big, cymbals can be small. And they are made by taking brass and spinning it over and over and over and over again until you get to the desired circumference. This is one long piece of brass. So is this one. This one's just easier to see. These are crash cymbals. You use these straps to hold them in your hands and you crash them together. This is a suspended cymbal because it's suspended on a stand. There are different kinds of suspended cymbals, like hi-hats or splash cymbals or crash cymbal or not crash, this is crash. And often it goes by the size of cymbal as to whether it's a crash or it's a splash or it's a hi-hat. The hi-hat is two cymbals together. They kind of look like a clamshell. Ride cymbal, thank you. That's what I was looking for, remembering. So you find suspended cymbals all over the place when you have a drum kit. Here is an example of a hi-hat right here. You can see that there is a top cymbal and a bottom cymbal, and there is a foot pedal down here that when you step on it, it changes, it opens this up. So you have probably seen drum solos before. And some kits are very elaborate, but then you think about Ringo Starr, who had, basically a bass drum, 2 snares and 1 or 2 cymbals, and he did amazing things. So, sometimes more is not necessarily better. No snares on that drum. These cymbals have holes in them, so you put down those. See that hi-hat opening and closing? Snare drum, you can hear the snare in it. Ta-da!
The show configuration of 2.
Tambourines and triangles. Guess which one is which? This is the triangle, obviously, because it's shaped like a guess what triangle. Notice that it is open here. It is open here because that's where the sound waves come out. You strike it on the closed side with usually a little metal bar called the beater. And then the sound waves travel through these arms and out. And when I used to teach beginning band, I would demonstrate that. I would strike the triangle and then I would wave my hand in front of that open space and you could hear my hand pass through the sound waves and all the 6th graders would go, ooh, because it's pretty cool. And this is a tambourine. Some don't have a head, so this would just be an open circle, but most do. And you strike the head with your hand, or in this case, they're using drumsticks. And then these little jingles on the side are what actually produce the jingly sound. I don't have video of that. I'm sure you have heard triangles and tambourines before, so I'm trusting that you know what those sound like. Castanets. Castanets are used in Spanish music. we're into the part of percussion that adds flavor. You know, if you're gonna cook, you grab the spices off of the shelf and you add a little bit of this and a little bit of that to make it taste a certain way. And by using things like triangles, like tambourines, like castanets, you can make music sound a certain way. It colors the music and it flavors it. Castanets are used in Spanish music. They can also be mounted on a board with springs so that you don't have to use them and clap your fingers together. The traditional castanets go on your fingers. Flamenco dancers, notice I did not say flamingo dancers, I said flamenco dancers, traditionally use the ones like the ones in the picture. Now, flamenco dancers would do that while they were dancing, while their feet were moving. Again, a good example of syncopation. I'm gonna stop there. That's pretty cool. And here's an example of a very short flamenco dance. She's not gonna use castanets. She has no castanets. Bongos and congas get mixed up all the time. Bongos are short. Congas are tall. And it's hard to tell in this picture, but this bongo is smaller in circumference than this bongo. So this one is going to play slightly higher than this one. Again, it's hard to tell in this picture, but this conga is bigger in circumference than this conga. So when you go from drum to drum, you're going to get two different sounds, higher and lower. This is the djembe, which is African in origin. They're made of wood. They can be carved, they can be very decorated and carved, but they're hollowed out. This bottom is hollowed out. This is hollowed out. And then the head is attached with, sometimes this is string, sometimes it's usually string. Heads were traditionally made out of some kind of animal skin, like goat. But those tend to dry out and crack and break. So today, many of these are made with synthetic heads, like a fibrous skin head, because those don't crack and break as easily. And this is a doumbek. Looks very similar to the djembe, but this body is made of metal, hollow metal. And it has these tuning pegs, sort of like what we saw in the timpani. These can also be very decorated. This one's kind of plain, but often you see doumbeks that have a lot of engraving on the metal. These are Middle Eastern origin. A couple more Latin percussion instruments, the güiro. You can scrape it, you can tap it. These are sometimes shaped like a fish. You may have seen them, especially in elementary music, shaped like a fish. These are called the go-go bells. Notice one is bigger and one is smaller. So this one's going to play higher than this one. And of course, our friend, my friend and yours, the cowbell. So here's an example of some Latin percussion using congas, cowbell, güiro, and these look like timbales. Rocket. Cowbell. Timbales. Ave. Good. Girl. A salsa in this case isn't what you eat with chips, it's a dance form. Okay, so that brings us to the end of our percussion section. So next week, we are planning to do an instrument identification test that will come from the instruments we've talked about for the last 2 weeks. It will be presented online on screen, and there will be a Google form to put your answers in, sort of like we did with the vocab test. The slides from last week should be on Google, and sorry, mine app, I'm used to saying Google Classroom. So go back and look at those if you need to, and there will be questions posted, probably tomorrow, because it's almost 8 o'clock now, and I have to convert this video. So I'll probably post questions tomorrow for tonight's class. If you're watching the recording, tonight's code word is pitched. Pitched, like pitched percussion, like the timpani and the keyboard instruments are pitched percussion. So that is your code word for this week. Okay, as always, if you have any questions, shoot me an email. And if not, I will see you next week at 6:30. Have a good week. See ya. Have a good week.